Okay, sound check. 1, 2, 3.
What's that coming from? The computer microphone or his microphone?
Should be.
Yeah, I heard that. But can you face that wall and speak?
Sound check. 1, 2, 3.
That's live. Okay, change the name of the you're also getting an external microphone feed as well.
You gotta browse. Well, there is. Okay, good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to the Gateway Regional Chamber of Commerce sponsored debate for the 7th Congressional District of New Jersey. We have been hosting these debates for more than 20 years. We are a business organization, the largest in the New Jersey, New York metropolitan region, and we are unequivocally strong supporters of a vibrant economy and a strong business community. As such, these debates are comprised of questions on issues that concern businesses. Our plan and our goal this morning is to have a serious discussion on these issues. We hope that you will find it both incredibly boring and informative. We need more detail than the 1 or 2 lines that are contained on each of the candidates' websites on these issues. Let me also say that I have known both these men and worked closely with them for many years. I respect them both. They are both serious, they are both thoughtful and smart, they are both gentlemen and patriots, and I expect them to comport themselves as such in this morning's debate. A quick note on titles. Both candidates have prestigious titles. One is a congressman and one is senator. In this form, however, they are both applying for the position of representative for the 7th Congressional District. And as such, I will use the title of Mr. Finally, let me say that I do not care much for the debate format. The time is way too short to discuss the issues that we will be talking about today. 3 minutes is not enough time to have a serious discussion on any issue of importance. However, in covering 5 issues, that will take all of the time that is allotted. And those 5 issues were culled from more than 50 that were submitted by chamber members. On the ground rules, each candidate will have a 3-minute opening statement and finish with a 3-minute closing statement. The order was determined by coin flip. Questions will be on 5 topics. The topics were provided to the candidates in advance, but not the specific questions. Each candidate will have 3 minutes to answer the question. Each candidate will then have 2 minutes to either rebut what their opponent has said or 2 minutes to answer a follow-up question. There is a timekeeper who will hold up a yellow card when there's 30 seconds left and a red card when your time is up. The candidates will be asked to answer the question that is asked and to talk about their own views rather than the views of their opponent. Both have gone to candidate school and have been taught how to use Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi as an insult to their opponent. I ask them not to do that today. Finally, we have a small in-person audience and a big external audience, but I ask that the audience refrain from getting overly excited and clapping or yelling or making rude noises on to the candidates' responses. And finally, I want to thank quite a few people, our sponsors this morning who allowed us to put this on, the campaign managers for both Congressman Malinowski and Senator Kaine. My chamber staff worked days and days to make all of this happen. And we have Kaz Beelan from Premier Media, who is doing the videoing and the live streaming of this morning event. And finally, I would like to thank the Holiday Inn, who has worked closely with us to put on this meeting. And now we will move to the candidates. And I will ask each candidate to make their 3-minute opening statements. Again, the two campaigns have flipped a coin to determine the starting order. And Mr. Malinowski, you will be beginning.
Thank you so much, Jim. Senator Kaine, good to see you. I look forward to wonking out with you today and appreciate the chance to talk about substance. And I'll start and I think finish on a theme that comes up a lot in our conversations, and that's bipartisanship, reaching out across the aisle. This is something the two candidates here agree about. But in keeping with your theme, Jim, I think we should acknowledge that bipartisanship is a method. And what's important is your purpose. What is it that we are reaching across the aisle to do? What are specifically the solutions that we are pursuing? And we both have records. We're both incumbents, less than 2 years in DC, almost 20 years in Trenton. So you can compare our records, and there are differences that we will bring out in this debate. I'm for the Affordable Care Act. Senator Kaine is against it. I've been delivering funding and approvals for our all-important Gateway project. I think that Governor Christie's cancellation of the ARC tunnel was a historic mistake. Senator Kaine continues to defend that. I have been holding out for a coronavirus deal that will benefit New Jersey by delivering relief to our small towns, our counties, to our state government. And Senator Kaine's campaign criticized me for holding out for that kind of deal, wanted me to accept something less. I have been leading a bipartisan coalition in Washington, D.C. to take on the horrible extremism on the left and the right that we have been experiencing in our country. Just last week, I passed with almost every single Republican vote standing with me and resolution condemning this horrible QAnon movement. And I'm afraid, for some reasons that I cannot quite understand, the Kaine campaign and the National Republican Party in their ads here has been sending dog whistles to those extremists. Now, in this debate, we'll talk about a lot of those issues, particularly those that are important to the business community. And again, I look forward to being as specific as possible in my answers to your questions. But I think before we get there, there is something even more fundamental. You could call it the elephant in the room. Now, Jim, you know that in my past career as a diplomat, as a human rights activist, I spent a lot of time in countries like, say, Russia, that have market economies, very little regulation, very low taxes. Sounds great for business, but you don't want to be a businessman in Russia. We have an administration right now, low taxes, very little regulation. They've crashed the economy. More than 210,000 Americans are dead. We know the sacrifices that we made here in New Jersey to fight this thing. And then we see this ceremony at the White House a week ago with all of the glad handing, no mask wearing. There are people watching this debate right now who have not hugged their parents in months and months. Last week, the Monmouth County Republicans had a fundraiser. Indoors, no mask. Senator Kaine is there with his arm around people. I think that's wrong. I think we need Republicans and Democrats to stand against that kind of irresponsibility and carelessness and arrogance. And fortunately, that kind of bipartisanship exists.
I'm sorry, but your time is up.
Thank you.
Mr. Kaine, your opening comments.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you to the Chamber. It's great to be with you again. Thank you for your leadership in bringing people together in a strong and bipartisan way for decades. Thank you, Congressman. It's good to be with you at this podium and at this event so we can have a conversation with people of this district about our different priorities. Several months ago, I was at a veterans event in Cranford, actually right down the street. And at the event, there was told a story about a World War II veteran who, when he was thanked for his service, simply said, "Don't mess it up." Very simple, very straightforward. And when people look down at Washington, D.C. right now, especially when they look at the Congress and they look at the priorities, the massive attempts at regulation and increases, the fact that they haven't stopped and solved the healthcare issue, the fact they haven't solved the transportation issue, the fact that tax proposals are increasing, and they haven't actually solved any real problems. People realize that they're messing it up. Now, when you have a broken Congress, like we do right now, that impacts the people of the 7th Congressional District in their everyday lives. I've been a bipartisan leader in Trenton, whether it's on blocking billions of dollars of tax increases, finding innovative ways to create new jobs and economic opportunities, leading the way for the 2% property tax cap, making sure that healthcare is more affordable by making sure that we lower the cost of prescription drugs, making sure that if you've got a physical health that's treated the exact same as mental health or addiction services, making sure we protect the environment. I've been a leader on innovation and on transportation and infrastructure, making sure we get the first ever off-peak one-seat ride and building the progress for the Gateway project to make sure that New York, for the first time ever, is actually paying its fair share. That's the type of bipartisan leadership that's necessary on behalf of the people of the 7th Congressional District down in Washington, D.C. Because right now, too many people are talking at each other rather than with each other. If we're actually going to have a Congress that is actually working and working on behalf of all of the people of these United States, you need people who are bipartisan, reaching across the aisle, having a handshake, and finding the right answers. And I promise you that I will not screw it up. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Mr. Kane, the first question is for you. The topic is economic recovery. The economic shutdown caused by the COVID-19 pandemic has put the economy in a tailspin. Second quarter growth declined at an annual rate of 32%. Unemployment hit 14%, and though it has recovered to about 8%, we are in a serious recession. Over $3 trillion has been appropriated to mitigate the damage to the unemployed and to businesses. The HEROES Act, giving another $3 trillion of aid, has passed the House but has stalled in the Senate. Should the HEROES Act be passed, what should it include, and at what level should it be funded?
Okay. Thank you, Jim. I tour downtowns. In fact, I was just in Clinton Township just yesterday, and I talked to small businesses about their concern about the fact that they may not be able to continue to stay open, whether they were in the restaurant industry, or in the card industry, and in the candle making industry. And that type of uncertainty creates a lot of economic problems for people in this state and beyond. All too frequently, when you look at things like the CARES Act, which passed several months ago, $2 billion of that economic solution was held back at a time when we should have done what was on economic growth, which on the state level, which is a bipartisan approach to make sure that we solve the issues on education and transparency, making sure that we have telehealth and making sure that there are small business protections. Those are the type of solutions on a bipartisan basis and create this type of certainty that we need. Now, clearly, when you get a bill through, it's not good enough to get a bill through only one chamber. Getting a bill through only one chamber means the job is not done. It doesn't have a positive impact for the constituents of these districts. What I would focus on is making sure that you've got a solution that has, yes, aid to state and local governments, making sure you have additional monies to help the small business so they can have that type of certainty, make sure the unemployment insurance fund is protected and added to, just like I made sure on a bipartisan basis in the state and Senate that we actually had those types of protections to make sure it was there for them in their time of need. But those types of monies we need to focus on going forward, and on a bipartisan basis, it needs to happen. That $3 billion is too high. There should be a way we can find common ground where you have an executive branch, a legislative branch, all working together on a bipartisan basis. But the problem right now is what we did in the beginning in New Jersey was we actually found the bipartisan solutions in the first instance. We made sure that from the very first step that both parties were involved, and whether it was the executive branch, when we protected the liability for doctors and physicians and nurses and the first responders, we made sure that on economic issues and on recovery issues, from the very beginning, it was bipartisan. When you're looking at this solution, you see again and again when it comes to COVID or a variety of other solutions, it's always delayed, it's always partisan in nature, and it's always uncertain. That type of consistent uncertainty has hurt the families in this district, and we need a congressperson who's going to go down to Washington, D.C., and from the very first instance, forge the bipartisan solution so you have certainty and predictability from the very beginning. Thank you.
Mr. Malinowski, the same question. Should the HEROES Act be passed? Actually, you voted for it, so I guess that's pretty self-evident.
I haven't changed my mind. That's right.
What should it include, and what level should it be funded at?
Thank you. So yes, of course, yes, this was over 3 months ago. And first, let me just say, the CARES Act, the senator says Congress is broken. The CARES Act is one of the most successful pieces of legislation that Congress has passed in my lifetime. It delivered for our district more than $1 billion in support for our small businesses. Virtually every small business I speak to on those main streets was able to stay afloat because of the CARES Act. More than $1 billion for folks who lost their jobs just in our district. My office worked overtime every day after day after day to this day, helping over 1,800 of our constituents get those checks through this broken unemployment system in Trenton. So this was a success. But 3 months ago, we passed the HEROES Act. And Senator Kane's problem with it seems to be that it wasn't bipartisan because the Senate and Mitch McConnell blocked it. Well, maybe they shouldn't have blocked it. Maybe more Republicans should have endorsed it so that we could have actually gotten this done for New Jersey and the country 3 months ago. We've now gone down to a proposal that we passed in the House last week that's only about $2 trillion. We're negotiating very, very strongly now with the White House. I'm relatively confident we're going to get something this week. And here's the difference. Senator Kane just said, of course, we should have state and local government assistance. And absolutely, this is of vital importance to every single small town in our district. Well, a month ago, when Senator McConnell put forward his proposal, there was no money for state and local assistance, nothing for our small towns, nothing for childcare, nothing for schools unless they fully reopened, as the president was demanding, nothing for transit, nothing for New Jersey Transit or for Amtrak, nothing for nutrition assistance for children. And his campaign criticized me for not immediately signing up to that proposal. He wanted me basically to roll over. I'm not going to do that. We have insisted on a package that, yes, will be less than the HEROES Act, will be less expensive, but will cover those things that are absolutely essential to our towns in New Jersey. This is not partisan here. We have more Republican mayors than Democratic mayors, as you well know, in our district. More than 50 of them, along with freeholders, both sides of the aisle, wrote a letter to Senator McConnell, to Nancy Pelosi, supporting our position that we fight for that assistance for state and local government. That's what I've been doing, and we are, I think, within days of a significant success.
Okay, Mr. Kane, follow-up question. This one is a 2-minute question. When should the economy reopen, and should this be done by federal mandate? And should we have another lockdown if infection rates remain high?
I think what we need is transparency, certainty. People have to understand at all levels of government why certain decisions are being made on behalf of growing the economy. I think shutting down the economy, we can't afford it as a country going forward. So what we need to do is make sure that we have those policies and those solutions that grow things. Like right now, the solution is going to be the cure for COVID. If we have an industrial resurgence that's focused very much on finding the cure to COVID or the next COVID, that's the type of thing that will make sure we grow the economy so we don't have to have another shutdown. But in order to do that, we need to have things like the life sciences industries, which are in this very, very district that create those types of innovation and those types of jobs. That's part of the economic recovery package, making sure that those types of, that we don't, as my opponent voted for a piece of legislation that would kill not only thousands of jobs, but destroy innovation over time, increase the cost of healthcare. So we've got to make sure that we have a policy that grows the economy, keeps people safe while we safely reopen, because at the end of the day, we need to have an economy that's growing, that's opening safely, that the states have a vested interest in finding their right solutions, and make sure that we have that type of bipartisanship in Washington, as I have led in Trenton.
Mr. Malinowski, the same question. When should the economy open? Should it be done by federal mandate? And if there is another high infection rate, should we look for another lockdown?
Yeah. So we didn't shut down the economy because of a virus. We shut down the economy because of our failure to contain and control the virus. The United States is the only country experiencing this right now among the developed, well-governed countries of the world. We're still averaging around 40,000 new cases a day. 800 Americans or so died on December 1st, the last day that we have those statistics for. No, European countries that were hit just as hard as we were are not experiencing this right now. Asian countries that were hit as hard as we were not experiencing this. And so the key to any sort of economic recovery has got to be to control the coronavirus, and that will require a national policy. Congress has done a relatively good job in funding a national response to coronavirus, but we cannot provide the leadership for all 50 states to ensure that these mandates are respected. And there is, unfortunately, as we are seeing in such dramatic terms this week, there is, as I said, a culture of carelessness, a culture of arrogance, a culture of disdain for science, for scientific advice, for public health guidance. Liberate Michigan, liberate Texas, making fun of people for wearing masks when what we need is leadership that is actually going to encourage people to do the right thing. We have states in this country where governors are actually passing laws denying local communities the ability to impose mask mandates on restaurants and public facilities. That has got to stop, and we need a national government that is absolutely going to lead that national strategy to conquer this so that we do not have to shut down the economy again. That would be horrible, but it requires leadership.
Okay, now we're going to move into government finance. And Mr. Malinowski, this question is for you. The COVID relief packages have exploded an already high national debt, which now amounts to nearly $28 trillion, or 140% of gross domestic product. Eventually, it will need to be paid off. How would you propose the funds be raised to start lowering the debt? And I hope that you will be a bit more nuanced than just saying tax the rich or let's grow our way out of it.
I will be much more nuanced than that. Look, right now, we do need to be spending a lot of money. And I think everyone I speak to in the business community agrees. What we have done this year, I hate the fact that we have had to do it, but we had to do it. And unfortunately, we are going to need another relief bill that will be expensive because otherwise our economy is going to die and there will be no revenue and we will have no country. But ultimately, we are going to have to think about the fiscal responsibility side of the equation. As you know, we've talked about this many times. I think that the 2017 tax bill was a disaster for this country. It was obviously bad for New Jersey because we lost our SALT deductions, but it also, over 10 years, if we don't do anything about it, adds about $2 trillion to national debt. That wasn't even a crisis. The economy was strong when we did that, and most of that money was blown on stock buybacks, which do, short-term sugar high for the economy and are doing nothing for us today. So yes, I do think we need to look at the corporate tax rate, which was lowered to 21% in that bill. The Business Roundtable asked for 25%. This was a lot more than the business community even asked for. I think we need to do tax reform that does what sensible tax reform always tries to do, which is to keep rates low, but to get rid of loopholes and deductions that complicate the tax code. We did nothing about carried interest in that bill. We have not yet tackled the overwhelmingly important problem of multinational corporations stashing their profits overseas and booking their losses in the United States to avoid paying taxes. You want specifics? I think one of the best solutions out there would be to basically change the corporate tax code system so that we are taxing multinationals based on the share of their sales that are in the United States. So it doesn't matter if they put their money in a tax shelter in the Seychelles or in Ireland. If 70% of your sales are in the United States and you're a multinational, then you pay the US corporate tax rate on 70% of your revenue. Simple, and it would deal with the tax avoidance problem. If we can get rid of some of these loopholes, and my goodness, we just read the story about the president's tax returns, which I think most Americans look at, and it just sort of fills them with anger because, here we have somebody who's, writing off $70,000 worth of haircuts and, hiring his kids as consultants and somehow getting out of paying taxes for these practices that the vast majority of working Americans wouldn't dream of being able to take advantage of. And meanwhile, they're taking away middle-class tax deductions that our middle-class homeowners have depended on for generations, like the SALT deduction, because they call them blue state bailouts. So those are the kinds of things that I would look at. Right now, we do have to spend, but sensible tax reform that closes loopholes, deals with the flight of profits offshore, I think would go a long way.
Thank you. Mr. Kane, same question. How would you fund the repayment of $128 trillion of debt?
Every family, whether it's on a nightly or weekly basis, sits around the kitchen table and tries to figure out how they can afford to live in New Jersey. They make those important decisions every day. And unfortunately, when you look at Congress, they've not made those decisions, and they had that thought process for decades. The most recent spending is not; it's just a continuation of a pattern. In state senate, I've served in the budget committee. I've blocked billions of dollars of tax increases, led the way to make sure we have the 2% cap on the property taxes, make sure we create new and innovative jobs that do create more opportunity and new tax revenues for the people of this great state. So if you go down to Washington, D.C., you need to do it have a leadership that's on a bipartisan basis to say, how do we get to an approach that starts to actually balance the budget over time? There was a serious conversation about balanced budget amendment in the 90s because people understood that the more debt you have, the less flexibility you have, whether it's as a household, whether it's as a state, or whether it's as a nation. So if you're going to be able to control your own destiny, we need to get rid of this debt. So I think there are a variety of things that we need to do when we do the real reforms. We need to have the SALT deductibility back. That's part of any solution. If we're going to get anything through on a federal level, it has to be, whether it's on taxes, on transportation, whatever it be. The best solutions are always bipartisan. But we've got the legacy costs that do exist for the citizens of New Jersey. So we need to get down to Washington, D.C., have the bipartisan leadership that makes sure that the tax policies over time are focused on. But just like I've done in the budget committee, where you go through line by line and say, what's wasteful spending, what is no longer necessary. But at the end of the day, the first thing we have to focus on is how we're going to make sure that we reduce the overall debt burden on our country. Because right now, we do need to spend the money to make sure that we have the economic opportunity, that the growth, and make sure that we can continue to afford to live in this country. But we need to have a tax policy that actually, and a federal fiscal relief policy, that's actually one that is sensible over time and affordable.
Mr. Malinowski, follow-up question. Would a widely applied carbon tax help raise the needed revenue, and would you support such a tax?
Just a very, very quick response on the SALT deduction. We both support full restoration of SALT, and I appreciate Senator Kane's sincere commitment to that. The difference is that his party in Washington is dead set against it. And so this isn't a challenge where you'd have to go and convince the Democrats. You'd have to convince your own party. Kevin McCarthy, Mitch McConnell, who have never even allowed a vote on restoring the SALT deduction. They want to make it permanent. I just don't think that's a realistic strategy. Taking control of the House of Representatives, giving it back to the people who screwed us, frankly, on SALT, I don't think is a good strategy. On your question, I do support a carbon fee and dividend plan because I think we need to take far-reaching market-based steps to deal with the threat of climate change and to seize the opportunity for America to become the world leader in building the clean energy technology of the future. I don't see it as a revenue-raising device. The way a carbon fee and dividend plan would work is that we would put a market price on carbon, and that money would go through the government and then be returned to every American as a dividend check. So it would not raise money for the government. We would get the money back. And of course, businesses, consumers that make the transition to clean energy fastest would make out the best. So it creates a market incentive, less regulation, more incentive. This used to be a Republican idea, by the way. And, along with cap and trade, since the ascent of the Tea Party and this administration, things have changed. But this is absolutely what I embrace because we need a concrete answer to how we are going to deal with climate change. It's not enough just to acknowledge it exists. We need to have a plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kane, same question. Would you support a carbon tax and use that to pay down the debt?
If I can get a tax cut through Phil Murphy, standalone, I can get bipartisan tax reform down in Washington, D.C. I can work with on a bipartisan basis to identify the solution to get that done. But simply adding yet another tax onto the economy is not the right direction to go. We need to have real consistent policies down in Washington, D.C. that people know over time are ways that can boost innovation and make a difference. And simply adding another fee, another tax. I mean, people in New Jersey are already taxed, whether it's the gas tax, whether it's the income tax, whether it's a corporate business tax, whether it's the property tax, whether it's a sales tax. I mean, the list goes on about how unaffordable New Jersey is. So what we have to have is an individual who understands that unaffordability as the first impetus for going down to Washington, D.C. to make our state more affordable. That starts with SALT deduction and working down there on a bipartisan basis on both parties to have one that's sustainable over time. Any package that's put through with only one chamber, simply saying I can't, that a person in any chamber can't work with a person of another chamber is unacceptable for the citizens of this district. In Trenton, it doesn't matter to me whether it's working with Steve Sweeney, who's the Senate president, or Craig Coughlin, who's the Speaker of the General Assembly. What you do is you call them up. You work on a bipartisan basis. When it's Phil Murphy or Governor Christie, when I've been in the majority or the minority, you go and you work with those individuals, say, how do we find this solution in the first instance? Simply saying it's through one chamber and that's enough. Simply saying it's only going to be one party, that's not good for the citizens. This district, this state, this country needs bipartisan leaders like down in Washington, D.C. I've been that bipartisan leader down in Trenton. I will bring those same skills to make sure that our state is far more affordable and we don't increase the taxes on the hardworking citizens of this state.
Okay, now we're going to turn to immigration. Mr. Kane, this question is for you. Though it is rarely mentioned in this year's election, immigration reform has been one of the most contentious issues to face this country. If you could get exactly what you want, what would the immigration system in the country look like?
I've served in the state legislature for 19 years. And every day that I've served, I've seen very clearly in the lives of my constituents the impasse that has existed for the last 20 years in Washington, D.C. to help solve the immigration system and the crisis that happens all too frequently. That impasse has downstream implications on the citizens and the residents of New Jersey, whether it's on taxes issue, education, healthcare, regulatory system, hospitalizations. So we need a clear and consistent and bipartisan solution down in Washington. It starts making sure that we have border security. We're a nation of laws. We're also a nation of immigrants. We should start with a very clear principle. There should be no family separation. And we should make sure that there are more judges that can go down to the budget, to go down to the border, to make sure that you can resolve these family issues with immediacy. And so we can have so you've got that predictability. You've got to make sure that as we reform the H1 and H2 visa systems, whether they be on agriculture or technical workers, that there's that type of predictability for the agriculture workers or for the tech people. You've got to have more of an e-verify system to focus on that. But if you also have to have a pathway to citizenship for those individuals who are brought here by their parents. Those are the types of bipartisan solutions that I think we can accomplish if we actually had people who could reach across the aisle and get things done. Because for the last 2 years, much less the 16 before that, there's been no real solution that actually has addressed these issues and many more, and those consequences on all of our families. And that type of unpredictability creates grave uncertainty within the immigration system as well as the job creation system.
Thank you. Mr. Malinowski, same question. If you could design the immigration system, what would it look like? Thank you.
As you know, I am an immigrant to this country, came here when I was 6 years old with my mom. I started thinking about the line of work that I'm in when I was a little kid, trying my hardest to be the most all-American kid in the world, as so many immigrants do, because when people choose this country voluntarily, they embrace what makes it great, even more consciously, even more intensely, I think, than many folks whose families have been here for generations, because immigrants want to prove ourselves. Look at what's happening right now. It's not just family separation at the border. That was cruel, it was hateful, but it's so much more than that. We have stopped admitting refugees to this country for the first time since before World War II, when we turned back people fleeing Hitler's regime, Jewish refugees trying to save their lives by coming to America. We're doing that again today. We have shut down asylum at the border. Talk about family separation. The administration right now is trying to deport hundreds of thousands of families who've been in this country under the TPS program from Central America. These are hardworking people. They live in our communities. They have jobs. They pay taxes. They have kids who were born in this country, fully American citizens. What do those kids do if their parents are deported? H-1B visas, that's shut down right now because we have an administration that is hostile to legal immigration. It's harder to become a citizen. It's harder to get a green card at every stage. They are trying to shut down pathways for people who want to become American. So number one, we've got to have leaders who will call that by its name, who will stand up to things that are wrong, as I have. My opponent finds it more difficult to do that. What am I for? There has been bipartisanship on immigration in the Congress. There has been a solution put forward. 68-32 in the United States Senate. That was the vote on Senator McCain's immigration reform plan in 2013, which provided a pathway, a long pathway to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, that imposed E-Verify on every single business in this country, because if you don't want undocumented people coming here, you've got to go to the business owners who hire them, who pay them, and that funded a significant surge of support for border security. That was the compromise. Democrats were for it. Wise Republicans in the Senate were for it. What happened? It was shut down by the Tea Party and the more extreme Republicans who controlled the House of Representatives. Never got a vote. That's what I am for. Let's elect a House majority and a Senate majority that will pass that bill. That's my specific answer.
Thank you. Mr. Kane, you mentioned the H-1 and H-2 visa programs for guest workers, which have not worked very effectively. Would you be in favor of a completely new guest worker program and be willing to allocate the funds that are needed to track the people who are in it?
The first thing is, my opponent talks a great deal about things in the past 2013. For the last 2 years, when Democrats have been in control, they have not passed immigration reform. They've not actually addressed this issue in any way, shape, or form. So this is not an issue. This is an issue that we need the bipartisan leadership now and going forward. That's a problem. The second thing is, yes, we need to have a fundamental reform of both the H-1 and the H-2 visa systems, because when you talk to our farmers, the type of uncertainty that they have and the delays in the implementation of those process of having those employees coming in means that they don't have a predictable workforce. When you talk to the high tech and those types of educated workers who are here and we want to stay here and create more opportunities. So yes, you need to do that, and you can solve that issue. One of the things you can do is it doesn't have to be part of the overall immigration bill. You can break this down, just like we do in the state legislature, where you're able to break down component parts of important legislation and have a solution on the guest worker programs that currently exist and are currently deeply flawed in this country. And we need to have bipartisan solutions on that front. But we also need to address the broader immigration issue that I laid out earlier. So yes, we need that.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're going to move into healthcare now. Oh, I'm sorry, we're not. Mr. Malinowski, same question for you on the guest worker program. I get confused up here, there's a lot going on.
That's fine. So we actually did do legislation in the House on the guest worker program. We did. We passed a lot of legislation in the House. A lot of it, unfortunately, is about putting out fires, right? Because we have an arsonist who keeps on setting fires. So, we've had to deal with the child separation. We've had to deal with the shutdown in asylum at the border, which is just a horrible example to set for the world. We ask, when I was at the State Department, I'd be asking governments all around the world to do their part in helping people who are fleeing violence and oppression. We've completely shut that down. We've passed bill after bill after bill to try to promote a sensible immigration policy that includes reform to the guest worker program, that includes provisions that require the funds to be spent so that our farmers and others are not waiting month after month after month, waiting to see whether their workers will be able to come. But you know what happens? And by the way, it's bipartisan in the House. We have Republican support for these things. What happens is it goes over to the Senate, and all they do there is confirm judges. And no, Senator, you will not get a chance to have a phone call, the traditional Ronald Reagan support for refugees and immigration.
Okay, we're going to move into healthcare now. And as we do, I would appreciate if both candidates would confine their answers to policy and forego the normal tear-jerking stories that usually accompany these discussions. So, Mr. Malinowski, question is for you first. The Affordable Care Act was designed to get more people health insurance coverage and to lower costs. It kind of succeeded on the first goal, but failed to control spiraling costs. If you could get exactly what you want, what would Malinowski Care look like?
We're not going to call it that. My name is way too long. All right, I'm not going to tell you tear jerkers, but I think it is important and I will answer your question specifically. But I think it is important to remember, as imperfect as the Affordable Care Act obviously was, at the height of this pandemic, my office was getting dozens of phone calls from constituents who had lost their jobs, asking how can we sign up to the Obamacare exchanges, and we were helping them do it. Thank goodness we had this as an option for people who needed help at the height of this crisis. And I say that because right now, the question before us is not how do we build on the Affordable Care Act, but whether we preserve it. Because as you know, the administration's in court trying to strike down the law with no replacement. And we now have a new justice, about to be new justice of the Supreme Court, replacing Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who has said that she would vote to strike down the ACA. So it is very likely that the Supreme Court next spring will strike this law down, and we will need Congress, if we believe that this is better than the alternative, to find a way to reinstate it. I'm for the ACA. My opponent is not. That's an important difference. What would I do to build on it, to make it better? I think if I had one answer, it would be to go back to the provision that we almost got into the ACA in 2009, lost by one vote in the Senate, and that is to give every single American the freedom to buy into a public option like Medicare. I'm not for Medicare for all. I'm not for blowing up our private system of health insurance, but I do want people to have more options, more choices, partly because I believe in freedom and choice as a principle, partly also because when there is more freedom to choose, there's more competition and we have lower prices. I think that is a very good way to get healthcare costs down. I'm sure we'll also talk about prescription drugs, where also I believe it's important to allow Medicare on behalf of all of us to negotiate for market prices for prescription drugs. That bill that Senator Kaine disagrees with would have saved taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars over 10 years, money that we would have put to lowering the cost of the Affordable Care Act and to NIH for research into new drugs, into new therapies. I think that would have been a very good deal for the American people.
Thank you. Mr. Kaine, same question. What would Kaine Care look like?
Well, I've actually been a leader in state Senate to make sure that prescription drug costs are lower. That you treat the physical, mental health, the addictions, all the exact same with insurance companies. Make sure you have pre-existing conditions are assured in the state of New Jersey. Because I know that every single day, people in this district and people around the country are making the painful decisions to whether to pay for their prescription drugs or to put food on the table. And that's not a conversation that we can have. Regardless of what happens in Supreme Court, starting next spring, we need to address the healthcare crisis that we currently have in this country on a bipartisan basis. And there have to be several principles. We have to make sure we have far more transparency. We need to, so we know what the costs are at every level. We need to make sure that we cover pre-existing conditions, that kids can stay on the parents' health care up until 26. We've got to figure out what are the systemic problems that have been identified during the COVID crisis, whether it's in nursing homes or other aspects of the healthcare delivery system. Those are all component parts that we need to address going into the new Congress. We also cannot do that in a way that, as H.R. 3 did, which is the bill that my opponent talked about, the bill that would limit prescription drugs, about 250 types of drugs. You would limit innovation. You would kill 58,000 jobs in New Jersey alone in the research industries. Instead, you need to have an approach that on a bipartisan basis, I would hope, would follow some of the things that I've led on in Trenton, and making sure that you lower the cost of prescription drugs over time. You have certainty for things going from to the generic market. You have certainty to make sure that you've got innovation over time. Because if we are able to continue to have innovation and new drugs and new solutions that are identified and addressed in a timely basis, over time, you will lower the costs of hospitalizations. You will lower the costs of healthcare delivery over time, and then you will have a real solution that makes healthcare more affordable, more accessible, and is actually addressed in a way that's bipartisan in nature, as simply only being passed on a strictly partisan basis.
Thank you. Mr. Malinowski, you mentioned controlling prescription drug costs as one way of controlling costs. You mentioned a Medicare option, but what else could be done to control costs? They're spiraling out of control. I'm responsible for purchasing the health insurance in my organization, and it's very expensive.
Right.
My wife uses Medicare, and it's not cheap. All of this is very expensive. How are we going to control the costs?
Well, actually, I did give you two pretty substantial and in some circles controversial answers to that question. You asked Senator Kaine what Kaine Care would look like, and he basically described Obamacare. except he's against the law that guarantees things like protecting people with pre-existing conditions and that allows kids to be on their parents' plans until they're 26. So you can't be for those things and against the law that guarantees them. And in fact, you talked about your leadership in the state legislature. We have lowered health insurance costs in the last few years in New Jersey by passing things like our own state Obamacare exchange and our own individual mandate in the state of New Jersey. You voted against all those things. You voted against legislation to protect your constituents from surprise medical bills, which when I talk to folks who have insurance, that is their number one concern. That even when you go to the doctor, you go to the hospital, you have insurance, you still get this crazy bill and you don't know where it came from. So, that's your leadership. Look, I think what you hear from me is that the way to get costs down is through market competition, which I think is a business-friendly way to look at it. And Obamacare was a Republican idea. It was Romneycare, allowing Medicare to negotiate for market prices. That's a huge, huge deal, which, yes, is opposed by some of the pharmaceutical industry in New Jersey. The numbers you cited, by the way, come directly from pharma, from their lobbying organization. You get your campaign contributions from the same place you get your talking points. I get that. That's not what I do. I want to look at the objective facts. There's a drug, give you an example, called Revlimid, which was a cancer drug produced by Celgene, a New Jersey company. In 2005, it cost about $200 a pill. 10 years later, the price was jacked up to $765 a pill. Was it a more effective pill? No. But the CEO of the company did get a huge bonus for being able to make more profit out of that drug. And I want to do something about that. I want to, and when it comes to leadership, you sometimes have to stand up to industry lobbyists who naturally are lobbying you for their own self-interest, not necessarily for the interest of your constituents.
Mr. Kane, would you like to respond, or do you have other ideas on how we could cut costs?
Well, right now, the proposal that my opponent allowed to go through Congress with his full support would hurt innovation, would make healthcare costs over time for our constituents far more expensive. When you look at solutions like the surprise medical bill, I was a leader in fighting for things like the New York solution. The New Jersey solution is not, it creates, will drive doctors and out of the state and create more instability. If you followed the New York model, and we had the New York model from a negotiation perspective, you would actually solve the surprise medical billing. But again, because it was, that was the better approach. New Jersey's surprise medical bill will not actually solve the problem. If we go down to Washington, D.C. and actually solve the surprise medical billing problem, that would be something we can do on a bipartisan basis down in Washington, D.C. We need to drive out costs at every step of this approach. So when you're looking at how you actually lower these costs, you've got to focus on transparency at every level, from the innovation to the getting the people standing online or getting their prescriptions delivered to their homes. We've got to look at the cost in every single level there. We've got to figure out where the inefficiencies are, where the people are making poor decisions. Those types of efforts I've led, to make sure that the prescription drug costs are lower in New Jersey for some of those high cost out-of-pocket expenses. I've led to make sure that prescription drugs are for the physical health as well as the mental health and addiction services, that those are all treated the exact same. We've led the way to make sure that you have pre-existing conditions covered. But that type of solutions and that type of transparency will lower the cost of prescription drugs and make healthcare more affordable in this country. Thank you.
Thank you. So our final topic is going to be student debt. And Mr. Kane, I will start with you. Student debt in this country is about $1.7 trillion, which is almost twice as much as credit card debt. The closing of colleges and universities because of COVID has really driven home how unsustainable this debt is. Way too many kids go off to school, incur large amounts of debt, and then graduate with a degree that no one wants to hire. I know this because many of them show up in my office trying to figure out what they can do with a sociology degree or a Spanish degree. Most of the debt, over 1.5 trillion, is held by the US government. There are many proposals out to forgive this debt, as it has saddled tens of millions of young people with huge burdens. What do you see as the solution to this debt? And should school become free?
There was a New York Times story in 2017 about a parent who was called by HESA, which is the state higher education student assistance authority. And even though her son had died, she was still responsible for that debt. That led to the Senate Higher Education Committee, on which I served, to have a series of hearings to identify what are the issues from the state level that is driving the enforcement practices, as well as how these students get into these debt and these families. And one of the things that we saw, and one of the things we sought to address, was first and foremost making sure that the parents and the students know upfront, as early as high school, to make sure what these debt obligations are over time. And so that you have far greater transparency. I made sure that because of these type of enforcements, I was the sponsor of a piece of legislation that prevented certain type of debt from being collected unless you had a judicial support in that regard, so that you wouldn't have some of the hard, way that these companies come back and force these debts. So the second thing you need to focus on is you got to get transparency within the education system to understand why college right now is so expensive and why the costs have gone up so much. We also need to make sure that people understand that, because right now, one of the other issues you have, in addition to those individuals you talked about who have a degree and massive debt, that you also have a situation where so many people have the debt but don't get the degree because college is so expensive, and then that compounds that. So what you have to focus on are the solutions like I've done in the state Senate to make sure, whether it's veterans, whether it's parents with kids going back to college, whether it's making sure that you have a much more affordable college system for people who go through our own in-state, whether they be with the NJ Dreams Act, for example. So you need to have that type of predictability, and you need to have that type of compassion as you're looking at people who are having this debt, because I think those are the types of things that we need to work on together to figure out how to make sure that these costs are less, but also make sure that we have a process that is fairer to the people who are borrowing.
Thank you. Mr. Malinowski, same question. What's the solution for all of this debt?
Thank you. So as you said, it's $1.7 trillion. There are around 40 plus million Americans right now saddled with college debt. And it is a drain on the economy, among other things, because these are young people in their 20s and their early 30s, just at that point when you want them to be buying that first car, buying that first house. And when they're saddled with that kind of debt, it becomes impossible. Now, that leads to proposals like, Bernie Sanders, forgive all of the debt. I don't go quite that far, because I also think about families I've met that have sacrificed year after year after year, foregoing vacations, saving money, foregoing luxuries, because they want to help their kids get through college without debt or to pay off their student loans. And I don't want to say to those families, we're just going to wipe it off for folks, even students and families that can afford to pay back their loans, because they are getting good jobs after graduation. So what can we do? The middle ground solution, I think, is number one, cap monthly payments. There are good proposals out there, for example, capping monthly payments for payback of student loans to 5% of discretionary income. Something like that, I think, would be fair. Number two, interest rates. Right now, interest rates for most student loans are between 4 and 7%. The Fed's discount rate is 0.25% and has rarely gone up beyond 3% since, I think, 2008. Average mortgage interest in this country is about 3% as well. Why are young people saddled with loans that are carrying 4, 5, 6, 7% interest. And Congress has a lot to do with those interest rates. Why haven't we done anything about it? Because, well, the financial industry lobbyists, there are more of them in Washington than there are members of Congress. And they're handing out campaign contributions, corporate contributions to senators and to congressmen who accept those. And so we haven't had progress, but that's a very simple thing to do. And then finally, we have to continue to crack down on for-profit colleges. Talk about worthless degrees. And I'm going to disagree with you, Jim, about liberal arts degrees. I'm going to defend those folks, especially now. We need more people studying history and sociology.
I'll start sending them to you when they're
That's
looking for a
fine, I'll
job.
hire. But these for-profit colleges that particularly exploit and gouge our veterans, people in desperate situations, charge them a lot of money, end up, with absolutely nothing that's worthwhile. I've sponsored bipartisan legislation in the House of Representatives to crack down on that. Where, again, the administration under Betsy DeVos has been moving in the other direction, but we're fighting it in the House. So those are some specific ideas for you.
Thank you. Senator Kaine, would you be willing to look at a loan program that varies based on the type of study that a student is pursuing? In other words, giving better terms to someone that is going into a career-oriented field of study, for example, the STEM fields?
I think we've done experiment on some of those things from nursing degrees and other things like that on certain loan forgiveness programs if you can stay in the state level. I think that when you're graduating with a field in whether it's a history major, so liberal arts as I was, or whether it's on a STEM program, I think there are ways you can create a program that's sustainable and affordable. Over time, you need to have predictable interest rates. But I think we need to actually look at whether it's on the state level or on the federal level. The way we fund higher education hasn't been looked at for generations. And since Rutgers became the state university, for example, in New Jersey, when you look around the Congress, there haven't been long-term proposals that actually looks at how we fund the higher education system so it's more affordable over time. And so I think that there are things that incentives that can be done on the state level, but I think that we should have lower overall interest rates that impact all students, but I don't think there should be a different interest rate depending on the different degree.
Mr. Malinowski, same question.
My answer would be no, because I'm going to continue to defend the liberal arts here. In fact,
we agree.
Yeah, we agree on that. I'd like to get in the Common Core. I'd like to get civics in there. I think politicians have been understandably talking about STEM for many years, because there's that immediate connection to economic growth. And there's a lot of federal and state support for research in science and technology, which does enable our colleges and universities to offer more scholarships and to make it easier for low-income kids to go into those fields. And we should continue to do that big time. I would do much more as we do clean energy bills and infrastructure bills. But I don't think government should value one form of education over another. In fact, if anything, we need more emphasis on folks understanding the history of our country and how our government works, and studying ethics and philosophy. These are things that are lacking right now in our country with very obvious consequences. Loan forgiveness. This is very, very important. I think we all support loan forgiveness for people who go into public service, public interest type careers. There is a federal program, and for whatever reason, under the current Secretary of Education, 99% of the kids who have applied for loan forgiveness under this program that Congress passed on a bipartisan basis have been rejected. 99%. There's something absolutely fundamentally broken about that. And we have been trying through oversight and through passage of legislation in the House to fix it. And again, we have some resistance from the administration that is going to have to be overcome to fix something that I think we both would agree is very good and very important.
Thank you. Now we're going to move into the concluding remarks. And this will also be based on a question so that we can get an idea of your underlying philosophy. So Mr. Malinowski, you will be first. And the question that I'd like you to address in your closing remarks is that businesses don't like uncertainty. But since the start of the pandemic, uncertainty has been the reality. This uncertainty, in large part, has been driven by a lack of consistent government policies, especially regarding reopening plans. Please name the things that you would do to provide the business community with the certainty that it needs to thrive.
Sure. And I think you're asking a philosophical question, not one related to specific pandemic policy. And what I would say is that my philosophy, my economic philosophy is capitalism. And I see a capitalist market economy as an arena in which companies and investors are the players competing against each other, and government is the referee, setting rules that are predictable, that are good for business, but also are good for society, because no market is perfect. Rules that protect us against pollution, rules that protect our health, rules that provide a floor for people not to lose their health care, to have good housing, to have safety. And sometimes we forget that, no offense to the wonderful corporations that I work with, that you've introduced me to through the chamber, that when they come up to lobby us in Washington or Trenton, they're not lobbying for some abstract conception of market freedom. They're trying to work the ref, right? They're asking for subsidies and tax breaks and trade policies that are going to favor their company and their industry. And so part of my philosophy is work with business, talk to business, hear their perspective, but I don't want to be beholden to them through campaign contributions, through corporate PAC contributions. I'm trying to fix this system that I think has created undue influence on government in both Trenton and in Washington, D.C. And as for policy solutions, you have heard me many, many times come back to market-based solutions. And there's been an evolution in our politics on this. Again, the Affordable Care Act was Romney Care. It came from a Republican think tank. It was an alternative to government-run healthcare. On climate change and the environment, cap and trade, the carbon fee, which we already discussed, those were conservative ideas as an alternative to a state that used heavy-handed regulation. The Republican Party used to be for those things. They used to be for immigration reform in Washington, D.C. They used to be for national security, standing up to dictatorships like Russia and North Korea. And sometimes I wonder, where did all those Republicans go in Washington? And then I remember, yeah, they're all endorsing Joe Biden right now, because not that they agree with Democrats on every issue, but they realize that right now, what we need is the market certainty that comes from competent government, from honesty, from decency, for respect for the rule of law. Those are the things all of us, whether we own a business or are simply customers or employees of a business, those are the things that we need most of all. And there is a bipartisan coalition of decent Americans on both sides, Democrats like me, Republicans like Mitt Romney and Cindy McCain and Jim Mattis and so many others, who are coming together to say, right now, we got to put aside those differences and work together to get that kind of government back again. So we have market certainty and democracy certainty. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Senator Kaine, if you could use your closing remarks to talk about how you could bring certainty to the business community.
Well, it's about bringing, first of all, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Congressman. It's been an honor to be with both of you this morning, as well as with the audience. What we have to focus on when you go down to serve in public office, it's about making sure, first and foremost, that you're going down there to represent your constituents. And you're going down there to work with individuals who have been sent by their own constituents to solve the problems that are facing the people of the state or of this country. That's been my guiding principle from my very first day in office, when I've reached across the aisle to extend voting hours from 7 a.m. to 6 a.m. so more people would have access if they were commuters going into the polls. Whether it's focusing on bipartisan solutions that block billions of dollars of economic or new taxes and new spending on the state level, which creates more uncertainty. And when people look in New Jersey right now they see a lot of uncertainty from an economic perspective. And you guys state where generations of families have fought to stay here. And that type of uncertainty means that people are moving. So the parents are away from their kids, grandparents are away from grandkids. And what we need to have in Washington, D.C. is a focus on finding the bipartisan solutions that create the economic certainty. There are things like completing the Gateway project that will create economic certainty, consistent low tax rates that include the SALT deductibility, fixing the broken healthcare system, making sure that we protect the environment, things like blocking offshore drilling off the coast of New Jersey. What we have to have is a predictable system of government that is affordable and for the people of this great state. When people look to this country, we're the only country in the world that's founded on an idea. And that idea is reaffirmed every single election cycle when people go to the polls and reaffirm our founding principles. That's why this election is so important. Because we need to get somebody down to Washington, D.C. who understands that Congress is broken, that there's too much uncertainty for our taxpayers and our fellow citizens, that we have to make sure that people who take a risk to create a better future for themselves and their families have a future that is very certain. So they know that there's going to be tax predictability, there's going to be regulatory predictability, that they know that in places where the government should step in and protect those who are less vulnerable, that we do that. But that type of predictability is not happening in Washington, D.C. right now. Everybody in this state knows that Congress is broken. I've been a bipartisan leader in making sure we can make our state more affordable, make sure that every level of government is far more transparent, that we protect those needs. That type of leadership is the type of leadership we need down in Washington, D.C. if we're going to find the bipartisan solutions that are going to make sure that our country is far more affordable and we have the type of innovative leaders we need for the future. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I want to take the opportunity to thank Congressman Malinowski and Senator Kaine for joining us this morning to discuss these issues that are so important to the business community. I really appreciate the depth of your answer and the thought that you gave to them. Also, after watching a number of other debates, I really appreciate the courtesy that you've shown each other. I think that this is very important when we come to these forums, because it's not about what kind of cut you can make, but rather about what your ideas are. And you both really did that this morning, and I appreciate that very much. And with all of the audience, I would just like to remind you that your ballots are probably at your house, and fill them out and get them in early, but just make sure you vote. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.